Okay, I want to welcome everyone back to our discussion of the Kansas elections that took place this year. Thank you all for being part of it. I mentioned at the outset today that we were live streaming the program, and I just found out that we have a very influential and important American who's watching in his office in Washington, D.C. So please give a nice welcome to Senator Bob Dole, who's watching on streaming video. Hi, Senator. Glad you could join us. Let's go back to talking about what happened this year. And I want to start with Joan or Kelly. Either one of you can start first. But talk a little bit about what you felt that your role was, how, the kind of role you played in these two big races, but also some of the other races this past fall.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Typically, the role of the state party is about threefold. We first of all have to recruit a good slate of candidates. And I felt like we had done a really good job this year of filling the ticket. We had someone in every congressional race, in the Senate race, and all the way down the ballot in the statewide races, and in at least in the primary in 95 of the House seats. That was also a bit of a problem because that requires a lot of resources. And then you have to raise money to support those candidates. And then once you get those candidates filed, then you have to turn to providing the kind of support that all of those campaigns are going to need through the coordinated campaign. And much like the Republicans and what Kelly was talking about earlier, we ran the coordinated campaign with, in concert with our statewide candidates and our congressional candidates. So we focused on getting out the vote. We focused on trying to identify those people that we thought were going to be voting for Democrats based on our message, regardless of their registration, and to get those people to the polls. So we did more this year than in any prior year that I'm aware of for the Democratic Party in terms of raising money for that coordinated effort, in terms of the number of phone calls, the number of pieces of mail, the number of personal contacts, the number of volunteers. It just, despite all of that, wasn't enough.
Kelly?
Yeah. We actually have been prepping for this election. I mean, you could go all the way back to 2008 when Senator Roberts first ran last time and really built an infrastructure and organization for the party. And every year, or every election, we have continued to build on that. And a lot of it goes back to voter registration, getting an environment where we all work together. And you saw in 2010, we had our first clean sweep campaign, where we were sitting there with 5 Democrats in statewide office and ended up with 6 Republicans, having substantial majorities then in both the state Senate, the state House. We're almost at all-time highs in both of those chambers. In 2012, we continued to build on that, and 2014, our focus was we have got to get our voters. To get our voters out to vote. We're at an all-time high of difference between the number of Democrat-registered voters to Republicans. It's 350,000 gap right now, and the other thing that helps is we have an overall statewide grassroots group, and what I mean by that is we have functioning county parties in all 105 counties. The Democrats realistically are probably around 40-ish, something like that. And so we have people in every single county that go to meetings, that are engaged in the political process, that work for their local House candidates. Going into this year, obviously a lot of the work our grassroots do is in primaries. And so why the Democrats usually are gearing up for the general. Our guys are out working already for the primary candidates, and that parlay that right into the general election. So our volunteers were there. It was amazing to see the number of people that came out. I've never seen the number of volunteers ever. We had over 20 campaign headquarters in different parts of the state. Those were filled every day with volunteers on the phones, making phone calls either on phone banks or at home. We had a voter ID and phone banking system that we've never had before working, and it grew substantially in our capabilities when the RNC was able to step in and really help us out there. Turned up the number of contacts that we made, how to identify who we went after. The other aspect of not just churning out our voters that come out to the polls all the time, but going after those voters that maybe have voted once in the last 4 elections or even 0 times in the last 4 elections. We put together a door knocking program where we hit, I think, over 60,000 homes between Sedgwick County and Johnson County. And this was a very successful program and we targeted the people that normally don't come out and vote by putting basically an advance ballot in their hand, or an application for an advance ballot in their hand, and making sure they got that turned in. So it was a program that was very successful in 2010, 2012, and we just by leaps and bounds made it more successful in 2014.
Okay. This was discussed earlier, but I want to go back and focus a little bit more attention on it and ask Sean and Jim specifically to address Mr. Taylor's withdrawal and what you guys felt at the time, what opportunities you felt that afforded you, what challenges you may have felt that brought up that didn't exist with a 3-way race. Sean, do you want to start first?
Well, yeah, I think we covered this a little bit already, but I think it immediately gave us an opportunity. It poses significant challenges as well, having a self-funder in the race who's going to try to, be on both sides of the fence. But we also had an opportunity to focus our attention on one candidate. And as I said earlier, we had a very much a 1A, 1B strategy, which is nationalize the race, make this about Harry Reid's failure to lead and Barack Obama's failure to lead in Washington, and then informing voters that our opponent was just another Reid-Obama Democrat. And once we were able to focus our entire message on that, I think it took up really quickly, and it ended up being very successful.
Jim?
Yeah, I'll never forget the day that Taylor dropped out, because we had been, you were with us that morning. We had a group of moderate Republicans who endorsed Greg, and we're thinking we're going to lead the news today. And then James will remember that they had an ad come out the same day, an ad that they wish they had fact checked they're one of the stars of their commercial. That came out, and so I was mad that they were going to lead the news. And then somebody called me, or Greg walked in the door and said, Taylor just dropped out.
Can I tell that story? So I had an interview with Greg Orman that morning, and it was I was in the process of writing. It was going to be the big story of looking at the dynamic of the race, about this Orman versus Taylor dynamic, about how it was essentially the two were jockeying to see who was going to be the real challenger to Senator Roberts. And so, I had done a lot of reporting on it. I've been trying to get a hold of Taylor, and I think Brandon might be here, but I had called his campaign manager, and it said, we'll be coming over your office in about an hour. And they did, and they handed me a letter that said, which he had just dropped off at the Secretary of State's office, to say that he was dropping out of the race. In a short statement, Chad wouldn't take any additional questions, so it was this amazing scoop that I had, and broke on Twitter before we could even get it up on the Eagles site. But so it was this amazing. It was this thing of where, okay, first now I have to get this up online that Chad dropped out of the race, and then basically the story I'd spent all day writing was now more or less worthless, and I had to completely rewrite it. And Greg Orman was pushed down several paragraphs much
we were
lower
real happy about
in that race.
Can I just quickly, I actually talked to Chad Taylor the week before he dropped out and asked him if he was planning to do so, and of course he denied it sort of famously in that story that I'm in this race to stay. But we were clearly aware of rumors that he was thinking about it. And what I'm hearing today is, it was a big surprise to people. Was it that big of a surprise? I mean, we had heard people were calling reporters like crazy saying, Taylor's getting out, Taylor's getting out, and so.
I didn't think he would do it.
But you had heard the rumors, right, Joan?
Well,
that it was,
sure, and there were
So they were coming from
conversations.
somewhere.
Well, there were conversations which I would describe more as speculative. The people who follow politics and think they understand it all said, well, we couldn't possibly beat Roberts with 3 people in the race, but somebody needs to get out. And so that kind of conversation was going on. Chad's conversations with groups, I remember being in Beloit with him for an ice cream social, and he was talking about what the math was and how he could win the race. So he was talking about, throughout that campaign, what it would take for him to win with 3 people in the race.
The tenor of the discussions that I recall in the week before the decision for Chad Taylor was that Pat Roberts was vulnerable to 1 candidate but not 2. If it was a 3-way race, Pat Roberts would win by default. And that therefore the decision on staying in or going out was up to either Greg Orman or Chad Taylor. And Greg Orman had no reason to get out. He had his own money. He had his, he was an independent. He was going to do what he was going to do. That meant that Chad Taylor, if there was to be a dropout, it would have to be Chad Taylor. And then you start talking to people, and they go, yeah, we've heard that. We hear the pressure's on. We hear he's thinking about it. So it could not have been a stunning surprise when that happened.
And they were having a tough time fundraising,
Well,
too.
he'd raised $100,000, I think.
That's the piece that I think is not in this conversation. Chad was an excellent candidate. He had not been able to get the money to come to him. He had anticipated early on in conversations with me being able to raise $7 million. And he had a plan on how he was going to do it and where it was going to come from. And I said, really? And, it just
He had
didn't.
a ways to go, didn't he, Joan?
It just didn't materialize. And so, having watched candidates when you're in a race where you can't win, why would you continue to put your hand in a meat grinder?
I do
mean,
think if we get back to money a little bit, and I think there's tendency you want to keep the campaigns apart, these 2 campaigns. At the same time, they keep bumping back into each other. And Paul Davis's success as a fundraiser in a democratic environment here took a lot of air out of any fundraising that Chad Taylor was going to be able
and
to
it
do.
did that for all of our statewide
Yeah.
candidates. It did that for the congressional candidates. The sad fact for Democrats is that we can't support 10 people on a ticket with a fully funded race.
I think, though, that this whole conversation goes to the point, this was a political decision by Chad Taylor.
I don't know that it was.
Well, I think we just said that if you, why run in a race that you can't win? And so I think it was very well understood, at least, especially among the electorate, like this is a political calculation that seemed to be scheming, and folks didn't like that implication that there was some backroom dealing going on that we're going to put the stronger candidate to do this or do that, and I think it also hurt Mr. Orman because it made it incredibly easy when Claire McCaskill's on Morning Joe beating her chest of how she got Chad out of the race, that look, Greg Orman is a Democrat in this race, and look at his political donations and his policy positions, and it made it a very easy case to make.
But with all due respect, there was an awful lot of help from the Republican side about promoting the idea that this was scheming and not just a calculus that Chad made about, I can't raise the money, why should I keep going? I didn't have a conversation with him after he decided to pull out, so I don't know why he did it. We just decided we'd support it.
I don't think any of us expected that Republican Party officials would be demanding that a Democrat run for Senate, and that Democratic Party
Absolutely.
officials would be talking about their right not to field a candidate.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone in any side of the political spectrum expected that to happen. I certainly didn't when I drove out to Kansas in January to take this job.
Well,
Joan, was there any thought or talk among Democrats, hey, we ought to get somebody into this race?
Yes,
Okay.
When Chad left?
yes. But the general wisdom, at that point I hadn't called an executive committee. I made lots of phone calls to people who were active on the executive committee or who were officers. We did have a call with what we call our core group, and decided that anybody that we would put in at that point in time would face the same problem that Chad faced, is where's the money coming from? How do you mount a campaign? So are we doing it to benefit Greg? Are we doing it to benefit the Republican? I mean, Democrats would have loved to have beaten Pat Roberts. No question about it. I mean, that's who we are, and you know that. But we just decided we'll stay out of it. Our focus was on the governor's race, and I think that's the appropriate place where it should have been.
Sean and Jim, in effect, did the withdrawal basically allow the Roberts campaign to push Orman to the left and make him the de facto Democrat? And was that a key reason how this election was decided?
Well, I think once Chad was out of the race, I think that our message became exceedingly clear. And I think what you saw was, our message was clear and effective. You also have to look at the workings of the campaigns themselves. One of the things we did immediately was put Senator Roberts out there everywhere. He was doing 3 to 5 stops a day all across the state. We did multiple bus tours. We were everywhere.
Could we ought to throw in that Bob Dole was out there too.
Yeah, exactly.
Bob, I
And
know
then-
you're watching, and you may have made the difference in this race.
I think, and that would be what I was going to hit next, is then we also had a very clear message for surrogates to wrap their heads around. So we had people coming in from all spectrums, and then we had the greatest surrogate, Bob Dole, that we could possibly have out there at every stop he was making a part of his statewide tour, which I know we just completed. So it allowed us to be very clear, very concise on what we needed to do and what we ended up accomplishing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, we had a strategy from the very beginning, assuming that Taylor was going to stay in the race, that we were going to have to spend a significant amount of money to drive him into single digits. So it was the only way the math worked was for us to be able to do that. So we had gone up on the air early, which was counter to everything that everybody had said, is Greg ought to hoard his money, hold on to it, let's become relevant through as cheaply as we can, and then spend a ton at the end and miraculously get across the finish line. So when we had written off the idea that Taylor was going to get out, we heard all the chatter about it as well. So when it happened, it was a bit of a surprise, and we had to gear up as well. We had a tiny staff. It was a media-driven campaign, and it instantly thrust us into a national place where we got a vulnerable incumbent, and we've now established ourselves as a credible candidate, and now the arrows are going to come at us, and we knew it.
At the end of the day, Jim, do you think that Mr. Taylor getting out of the race was a plus or a minus for you?
I don't know. I go back and forth on this. I mean, certainly it opened the space and it nationalized the race, and it gave us a lot of exposure and instantly thrust us into this place of he's not just an independent, he's a credible independent that could actually win. But by removing him from this, it made it really, really difficult for us to counter their narrative of turning us into the nominal Democratic race.
Let's remember, say this was taking place Friday before the election. You had polls showing, and granted they were flawed polls. Well, you can all agree on that. But we had polls showing the Brownback race probably going to Paul Davis, and very, very close gubernatorial race. I think that I think in retrospect you've got the substantial margin on the Senate race, a less substantial margin in the governor's race, and we all create those narratives to go back from that. But a month out, 2 weeks out, 5 days out, these were two of the most competitive races in the country, and so I think that in that sense that I think we want to remember where the race was at that point, at least perceptually. Now, I'd argue that the Senate race probably by that time was moving away from Orman for a variety of reasons. But nobody picked that up. And your polling might have. The only person I've heard is Jeff Rowe, who had polling that showed Greg really losing substantially
Because
by
ours
the end.
didn't. I was just going through our
Right.
last tracking. We were up 2
Yeah.
into the last week.
Well, I think the polls were interesting all the way through, because we were getting very different anecdotal stories than what we're showing at the polls. They were always kind of in contrast to each other, and it would also, the other storyline that we haven't really hit on that has been curious for me throughout the process was the national media portion of this. And the Orman campaign, I would assume it was a decision made to kind of withdraw from that and not be a participant in that, because we would have national reporters in all the time, like, we can't get in with this guy, this is the whole thing. And it opened a door for us to really be like, well, that's because he's a Democrat and he doesn't want to be honest with you or with Kansas. And that was kind of a window opened with us that we very willfully walked
You wouldn't
through.
have done that if you had?
Well,
Yeah.
yes, we would have, but it made it easier.
Yeah, it was very conscious that we were going to focus, we were going to give Dave and Bryan calls instead of the Nationals. We were just not going to do national TV particularly because we knew you guys wanted to nationalize this race. We didn't want to nationalize the race. We wanted it to keep the focus on the broken system.
And it is truthful that the Roberts campaign was putting out these statements. Greg Orman's ducking the press. And it's like, I just had a 10-minute phone conversation with him today. He was maybe ducking the national press, but he certainly wasn't ducking the Kansas press.
One thing I think to note in here is, and Kelly, you mentioned earlier, the sort of robust presence of the RNC in the ground game, the ability to expand voter contact, and certainly you saw it. But one thing that the removal of Taylor and the nationalizing of the Senate race and the significant presence of outside groups in the governor's race, the Alliance for Freedom and RGA in particular, one thing it did, at least in my estimate, is if you look coming out of that primary, not only did you have in these two races incumbents that faced significant challenges, but you had a much smaller, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you had a much smaller electorate in the 2014 Republican primary than you did in 2010. You about a 32,000 vote drop off. 2010 is the sort of apex of the wave, if you want to call it, that there was clearly a smaller, more moderate electorate, the down ballot moderate Republicans who faced a lot of the same primary challenges that they had faced in 2010 and 2012 held on. And so coming out of that, I think that the ability to use increased resources, the seemingly endless parade of national Republican figures sort of helped, at least I would estimate, helped galvanize some of that voter contact, because certainly coming in, by August 6th, it looked like a little different electorate than maybe I had anticipated.
And one of the things that we ought to take away from this session, and I think just sort of globally out of 2014, and maybe the national panel this afternoon will discuss this as well, and that is that understanding and motivating turnout is the new thing in politics. It really is. We focus on mailers and ads and fact checks and stories that we write. But I think it's fairly clear that campaigns are becoming extraordinarily sophisticated about get out the vote, voter contact, voter outreach, using sophisticated algorithms and digital tools. Both Republicans and Democrats are going to have them. And third parties are going to, not third political parties, but third parties, the RGA or other groups, the Koch brothers. There was a story in Politico this week about their sort of outside effort. And one of the things that I thought was so fascinating about Kansas this year, and it's been touched on here, most of the spending was not by the campaigns, not even close. It almost in both races. In some ways, the candidate campaigns and, dare I say it, the candidates are becoming less important than the outsiders who are making their voices heard in races of statewide or national importance. And that's not just on television, although that's part of it, but it's get out the vote, it's social media, it's contact.
No doubt.
That's an extraordinarily important dynamic I think we saw in Kansas this year.
And we learned it the hard way by as an independent. We didn't have a national party to lean on for a lot of the fundamental infrastructure that modern campaigns rely on. And we also didn't have the third party in place organizations. They certainly came in and supported us.
But you knew that, Jim, going in, didn't you? You weren't going to have that infrastructure in place going in.
No, we knew it was a media game completely from where we were coming from, that we weren't going to be able to match up with knocking doors and making phone calls. We were going to have to be making it up from scratch, that our play was a much more broad, paid and earn strategy. And it worked very well, but we knew that we were going to be at a huge disadvantage if we became a threat early on, that the national money and the Kochs and the chamber and all those folks were going to come dropping bombs on us. And we didn't have those base organizations at the ready.
But it
to
wasn't
come
just
support
bombs
us.
on television, it's bombs in terms of what Kelly's talking about,
Absolutely.
voter outreach, 1 million calls.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we really, and Bryan can talk about this too, one of the things we have to understand as reporters is a lot of that outreach, messaging, voter contact is very much below journalistic scrutiny and radar.
Well,
So
there was-
that's an enormous challenge for us.
There was a lot of pro-life activism happening
Without
on behalf
question
of
at
the
the
governor that really didn't get much attention until after
Because
the
it was
fact.
very late,
Yeah.
very late.
Well, and it was
Particularly in
running
Wichita.
through the churches, too. I
Right.
kept getting repeated calls of people saying, can the churches do this? They, would pass out these slates that would be all Republican candidates, all pro-life candidates, and a lot of it in the African-American communities.
Well, and I would say, the third-party money, always look where the money's coming from. And it's
Yeah.
been very interesting, at least from our perspective, this last week to see that the committee to elect the independent Senate, the biggest, I believe, Orman super PAC got $1.5 million from Senator Reed, and then about $1 million, I believe, from Michael Bloomberg, which is something that we were saying throughout the campaign and kind of has validated very much in the last couple of weeks.
But was that a shock? I mean, was it, would the Republicans not have done the exact same thing had it been?
No, yes, the Republicans would have, but for a Republican candidate. So I think that was the point. Is like this is the Democrat Senate
Well,
leader giving.
this was enemy of my enemy is
Yes.
my friend
Well,
stuff going on here.
Well, and I think that's I think that I think it validates largely to our point was that there's one person who will always stand against Harry Reid and Barack Obama, and there's the other person who's leaving it up in the air and never really committed to being.
Do you think, Jim, in retrospect, that not declaring a party to caucus with was a tactical error?
No, I think that we should have come out more strongly and said we're not caucusing with either of these characters. We're not going to go with McConnell. We're not going to go with Reid. We're going to.
It would be just
we're
an
going to caucus.
independent and
Yeah, because nobody knows what a caucus is. I mean, nobody is talking about what a caucus is.
Well, I would hope that these
You
guys would
were
have called
planning.
you out because it doesn't work. Like once you get up there, you have to do it.
No. You can go sit in the well of the Senate and say, "Well, I'm here. Somebody tell me where to go." You could have done that. I'm not saying that would have
we'd be
been
slated on a committee. I mean, if that would have happened, it would have been very difficult for the state of Kansas because you wouldn't have been
but-
slated on any committees and had very, very little voice in the way it
but
works.
that's all insider stuff. And during a campaign,
Okay,
they would not have.
no, wait, please. We're running out of time here. I have two more topics I want to get covered, and then I want to leave time for Q&A from the audience. First, I want to get kind of brief responses on this. There clearly was a perception of a lot of, and not a perception, but reality of a lot of former GOP officials supporting the two Democrats in the statewide races. James, can you talk a little bit about how that came about? And then I want everybody to talk a little bit at the end of the day. That was a huge story at the time. Did it really matter at the end of the day? James, how did that come about? All the Republicans,
Well, I think the genesis of it was a dissatisfaction among the electorate, pretty broad-based, with the policies the governor put in place. And then there began conversations, I think out of the 2012 elections, when there had been a real sort of internal effort among, or at least when there was a split and a divide among the Republican Party, and that resulted in elections that were pretty, pretty vitriolic. What we saw was an opportunity to build a pretty broad coalition. That's the way we approached it. The conversations began. A lot of the actual work was done just recruiting by Republicans who wanted to support a more moderate candidate, wanted to support a sort of return to the policies that Kansas had seen. I get asked every now and then why you would do that in July. I'll be honest. People say, why wouldn't you do that late in the campaign? When you're a candidate with very little name ID and you're running against an incumbent, people have to want to fire the incumbent before Labor Day, or they're really, really not going to get there. So we decided to have an event and announce this endorsement. So I think that the question, did it have an effect overall, or did it end up having a result? Yes, but it probably ended up getting sort of, faded into the overall arithmetic of the campaign. It didn't have a sort of an acute effect you might have if you do it, 3 days before Halloween. Ultimately, I think that it represented what we saw in the electorate. If we're calling this a referendum on the Obama administration, in 2014, like we've done the last couple times, then again, we were, our campaign outperformed national Democrats in all 68 statewide Democratic races by about 8%, based upon how they performed against Obama's 2012. So we were clearly pulling Republican voters and independent voters. How we got there, yeah, I could sound really smart and say it was all the parts we got there, and all the plans. But I think that ultimately we had to galvanize some portion of the Republican electorate in our base. And that's because, as Jim can tell you, in Kansas, just based upon the numbers, if you're not a Republican, you're a Democrat. And that's it. And so you have to build a coalition, and that's what we aim to do.
I think, and I do think we should go back to the polling question at some point. I think one of the biggest losers in this entire campaign is this 100 or so, or 500 at some point, supposed moderate Republicans who haven't served the state since James and I were in grade school. The reality is they came out and they attempted to make a narrative, and the media was willing participants. I think to your point, Dave, the media's lack of sophistication in being able to analyze data and rather going for the easy story. I
request I reserve my time.
At the same time,
Mr. Chairman, I reserve my time.
at the exact same time, 100 between the primary and the general election, the Republican registration advantage increased by 7,550 voters. That doesn't just happen by accident. And you didn't see any ink on that. But you roll out these folks who have, by and large, are no longer in elected office. And that was the story and nationally and locally, over and over and over again. And it wasn't really, we don't believe, reflective of what was going on in the electorate. But it was something that was narrative-based, that was easy to write, and it was a good press conference. But the data and the facts don't support it.
Can I just
if
go
I
ahead
could
and
make
then-
one point, because I think that it's a relevant point to make about the voter registration. At the same time, our campaign made the determination that voter registration was going to be, in most cases, especially in a short timeline, sort of one step forward, 2 steps back. We have a pretty heinous law in this state that keeps it from being that way. So what we looked at was an advantage that Republicans had held in multiple races, and that was early vote and advanced ballot, and we focused on that as a strategy, which we ended up, again, as you guys added voter registration, much to your credit, we won the early vote. And so that was a focus of where we looked, because we knew that the law was crafted to make that, voter registration a little bit of a hurdle, to say the least. So I do think that there are elements on the ground that create that. I don't think, however, that I just think that at that point, when you're looking at galvanizing a coalition around somebody other than a Republican in the state, that was a big part of it. And certainly there are probably some personal feelings among people who endorse, but I think that helps build.
Very quickly, Dave, very quickly.
Well, first of all, we didn't cover that press conference, as you may know, at the Star. We did, however, cover it the next day when Jan Myers said she was not on that list and wrote that story, which stepped on that story. And James can tell you he was quite frustrated that the Star didn't get over to cover those endorsements. And then to sort of suggest reporters don't understand data from somebody connected with Sam Brownback is an interesting.
Thank you for making my point.
But let me say this. One of the things I think at the Star, I would just report, and Bryan may want to chime in quickly. The Star, we were not interested at all in endorsements broadly this year. We didn't cover, as Sean will tell you, we covered very few of the surrogate appearances, because I believe that endorsements are in this environment increasingly irrelevant to voters' decisions. They just don't decide based on some famous guy saying, "Hey, you ought to vote for."
I think
The
the
Eagle, which is the Star's sister paper, did cover the announcement. And I think the announcement was a big story for that day. The problem was if anyone was expecting it to win the election for you, I think was a little bit silly. The question is, what were those, and that was a question that reporters were asking that day, what were those 100 Republicans, some of whom haven't been in office for a while, but some of whom, Sandy Prager, right, she's still in office right now. You have a couple other people who still have some influence, Steve Morse. The question was, what were they going to do? What were they going to do to mobilize the vote for Paul Davis? And I'm still not clear on what their efforts were at that point. We didn't get a lot of clear answers from what they were going to specifically do that day. That story had a big impact for the day, but then they tried to repeat the story several months later, and it didn't have as big an impact
And the
later
January
on.
thing
And then there were things like the police union announcement. Endorsements alone can't be your campaign.
I think it's important, though, to make a distinction on endorsements. I think endorsements oftentimes get, and I know we got to get the questions, we got to get all plugged into one. And yes, sometimes maybe a personal endorsement here and there doesn't matter, but Senator Roberts was also endorsed, by Kansas Farm Bureau, Kansans for Life, National Rifle Association. I mean, these issue groups that bring with them a massive group of voters, I think those are incredibly important and do make a difference.
Yeah,
But you guys also had the Republican Rockstar Tour,
Yes, yes.
where you had
And I think that
officials
makes a
who
difference
aren't
to her.
Well,
Kansas officials
let's-
at all endorsing the
Let's
two
move
candidates.
to my final topic, and then we're going to open to Q&A from the audience. And, we have such limited time, it's hard to get through everything, so I missed a lot. I've taken a lot off my list for time. I hope all of you will ask these questions. But at the, bottom line, and I want to hear from each of you on this, what were the one or two key factors that you think decided the outcomes of these elections? Jim, I'm going to start with you.
Obama and Reed.
Brian, let's just go down.
In the
Congrats, thank you.
Let's just go down.
In the governor's race, a lack of definition for Paul Davis, and in both races, Obama.
Okay, Bob?
Turnout was a little above 50%. Half of Kansans sat this one out, voters, registered voters. Incredible, given all we've learned and all the work Kelly and Joan and others have done. So neither, God bless them, in their attempts, Greg Orman nor Paul Davis were able to get the voters they needed out, or get them interested enough. Mm-hmm. On the other side, the Pat Roberts campaign and the Brownback campaign did a very good job of getting their voters out with all their various efforts.
In one exit poll, people were asked, should government do more or should government do less? 64% of people said more, 32% of people said less.
Opposite.
Oh,
That being
Thank
the
you.
case, we shouldn't have lost.
yeah. I think this campaign came to, for the governor, as a referendum on his record, his agenda, and folks, I think that piece of information kind of encapsulates what this campaign was all about. And I think the governor won the campaign on ideas.
Okay, Joan?
I don't agree with that at all. I think it came down to money and negative campaigning, and particularly negative messages that dampened turnout, although turnout increased by 1.1%. So I think it's money and Obama and negativity.
Sean?
I think outside of Obama and Reed, I think we had a great candidate. Senator Roberts pushed back against the narrative of an aging Washington person by being out there nonstop across the state every day. And then we had a great organization, both nationally with people like Senator Dole, and then on the ground here with Corey Briss and Chris LaCivita coming in and really doing a great job.
Bird?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of stuff here. I think the campaign got nationalized. I think you had outside money coming in for Senator Roberts. Arguably, and I'd agree, as the campaign went on, he showed up. He turned out to be a pretty good candidate, but arguably the weakest candidate going in the entire country. Tremendous amount of national money comes in. That changes, all the stuff we've talked about here, changes the nature of the electorate that turned out, and it became more Republican. And I think the irony here, the ultimate irony, is going into the campaign, the weakest Senate candidate turned out to run a very good, very nationalized campaign, made the electorate much more Republican, won a substantial victory, and I do think that Governor Brownback, whose policies in the exit poll rejected 53 to 44 in terms of tax cuts, I think Governor Brownback came in on the coattails of Senator Roberts.
James?
Yeah, I think that if there had not been campaigns run, if either candidate had just sat in a room for a year and a half in our race and people had gone to the polls without any information, I have a hard time believing Republicans wouldn't have taken the attitude towards the president that they had a year earlier with them. I don't think anything was introduced into the conversation. A Democrat on the ballot was going to be Barack Obama's, disciple. So we knew that. I think that in our race, the amount of spending that was done was not surprising to us, but it had a significant impact. And I think that when we were able to distill, a conversation about the effects of education cuts, the effects of a tax policy, the effects on a state's economy, and have that conversation equalized, which is what we had to a certain extent, then the difference maker was a push away from the center, which was where each of the candidates wanted to be. And that was links to a double homicide, links to a strip club ad, and certainly we're all in politics. We know that's the name of the game, so we're not, it's the way it goes. We just knew that from our end, it takes a long time to win integrity, it takes a heartbeat to lose it, so we weren't going to go that way.
Okay, Dave?
I would say that Kansas is a microcosm of a national trend, which is increasingly our politics are polarized to the point that ideology is more important than issue position, facts. We wrote and wrote and wrote about the budget problems in Kansas, and the voters in essence said one of two things. We don't believe you, which is possible, or we know that, but we don't care. There are other things we're judging on. And so it's much more, I think politics increasingly is below the radar of reporters and media and sort of this kind of group, and it's ideological rather than fact-based.
Kelly?
Yep. When it gets down to it, I believe we won because the voters of Kansas support the vision of the Republican Party and the direction our candidates up and down a ticket, how they administrate their offices, what they vote for. As far as the data and numbers, I believe this is a midterm election, but I believe this is one of the highest number of votes we've ever had in a midterm election here in Kansas. And to go to for Governor Brownback, he got more votes total than the Senate race did, and won in that race.
Okay, time for your Q&A. Raise your hand. One of our students will come by with a cordless mic. Again, no statements, please. Ask a brief question. I only have about 21 minutes. Alex?
Hi, I'm Lori Hutflis, and I have a statement, Bill, before I get to my question.
Lori, please do me a favor, ask a question.
Okay, the question is this. Your panel, would Paul Davis have won, or would Greg Orman have won if the other one didn't run?
I'm not willing to say it definitively, but I think that Paul Davis would have had a stronger chance without the Senate race being as it was. The fact that, and that's not to really heap it on Greg Orman necessarily, but the fact that the Senate race became the spotlight, so much national money went in. I mean, you look at the TV ads, they were one message, where the TV ads both were on Obama, both you can't trust this guy, both this, it really did help. I think Burdett has a good point when he says that there was a coattails effect, that the governor certainly got a boost. I don't know if Mark would agree that he rode in on the coattails, but I think you would acknowledge that certainly Senator Roberts did help the governor in the race. Or would you like to weigh in on that?
I think to say that it wouldn't have an effect is absolutely would be wrong. I do think it mattered. I will say, the governor's race from the get-go, I think, was, particularly from the media and the academics perspective, was always had more attention, certainly pre-September 6th, than the Senate race. I think everyone was expecting their interest to be there. I do think it helped nationalize the conversation, and but like I think Kelly pointed out, the governor's race received more votes than the Senate race did. We believe more people showed up to vote for the governor's race than voted in the Senate race. And I think the ground game infrastructure, we've talked a lot about that. That was something we built over a 2-year period. The senator was certainly, senator's campaign, particularly after mid-September, really engaged in that effort. So I think, but I do think nobody went to the polls wondering what Sam Brownback thinks about a government, or nobody went to the polls wondering where Paul Davis was. So I do think that the race mattered. The race had certainly money coming in nationally that came in from the left and the right. National Education Association spent nearly $1 million. Kansas Values Institute was north of $3 million. So it certainly had an impact, but I think it went both ways.
If the Senate race was a non-factor, the governor's race, which was tight, may have been even tighter than it was.
I agree with that. That I think, and James would have an opinion on this, but when all the energy came in nationally on that Senate race, the gubernatorial race kind of got shoved to the background and allowed, I think, Davis to just go steady as she goes for a while and not have to be encouraged to do a whole lot in that race, because all the energy was coming at us.
Well, I think at the end of the day, politics is often a team sport, and I think that we, as a team on the Kansas Republican side, everyone helped each other. This is the second time around now we've run the Clean Sweep initiative, and I think there's a lot of thanks, Kelly and Clay and Heath at the state party, and then everybody down. I mean, I think both sides of the ticket. This down ballot voting always helps everybody on that.
But I saw the governor at the Kansas Book Festival. It was just kind of informally. It was about a week after Taylor dropped off, and I mentioned to him that his race had been pushed to the back pages, and his response was "woo-hoo."
Okay, let's go to our next question. Zach, you have a question?
This is directed at Professor Loomis. To what extent did the Republican moderate voters who voted for Davis vote for Orman? Was that the same group, or?
I mean, I think probably some people are more familiar with the crosstabs here than I am. But generally, yes. Although the Mark makes a really good point in terms of number of voters. There's certainly definitely not a one-to-one correspondence. And I guess my sense here is that what happened is that the nature of the turnout and the nature of the party turnout here became, as you guys have talked about in terms of what all the things you did, it became more Republican. We often think that there's a Republican group and a Democratic group, but the electorate itself changes from, and I think the electorate changed over the course of this campaign, and I think it became marginally more Republican, and I think in part of that was the barrage of campaigns, of campaign ads. It was all bringing all the people in. It was getting people out. There's a whole array of things, and I think it does get back to the whole question of moderate Republicans we were talking about before. How many times do you have to dig their grave? There are not very many of them. To count on them as a major part of a coalition, problematic.
Yeah.
Kathleen Sebelius did. I think it's a somewhat different Republican environment today than it was even 8 years ago.
Part of that is because, Bird, there was a national Republican wave this year. I mean,
There was.
and so for the Kansas electorate to change as it did should not be a surprise. It changed in virtually every state. There was a sense that there was a turn to the Republicans in the last 10 days, which I think may have accounted for 2 or 3 points in both these races.
I think one of the things that wasn't discussed was, I think when on a narrative basis, in July when Paul Davis rolled out the moderate Republicans endorsing him, I think from a narrative basis that was an easy story to tell. I think one of the main effects that we saw on the Senate race having on our race is when all those moderate Republicans, including Steve Morris, went and endorsed Greg Orman. And this was a question of Harry Reid controlling the Senate. And I think a lot of folks were like, okay, those people aren't really Republicans. If they're leaving Pat Roberts, and not just Sam Brownback, who folks on schools and taxes, if those folks, those moderate Republicans, were going to leave Pat Roberts, a statesman who'd done a great job for Kansas over many years. I think when Rochelle Cronister went on TV, when Tim Owens went on TV, I really think that had an impact with folks, a light going on the governor's race, and Republicans really came home and realized that it was kind of what those folks may have not been who they said they were.
Okay, Alex?
I agree. Is on? Is on? Okay. Brownback ran 2 ads that won for him. One was a smear and a lie, and the other was a direct appeal to racial prejudice. That was the so-called strip club ad.
Make your question, Ed, please.
I will. I got to put it in context. The strip club ad and the Carr Brothers, or the Willie Horton ad of Kansas, were what put Brownback over the top, in my view.
Do you agree with that, Mark?
I believe that Brownback lied, and that his condoning of these ads shows that his Christianity is deceitful and hypocritical. Now, have these kind of despicable tactics ever been used in previous Kansas elections?
Question mark, right?
Another star
Is there
reader.
ever a
My
question
former-
in any of that?
Writer. As my former boss would say at a town hall, we'll put you down as a maybe. I do believe that the ad related to judicial selection absolutely unquestionably made an impact on the race. I think the race had kind of come on a rut where we had talked about many of the same issues over and over again for 2 years, and whether it be schools, whether it be taxes. And it was important for us, both on the welfare reform ad that we closed with, as well as the judicial selection ad, to talk about and remind Kansans and Republicans of the variety of things that governors do. And one of the most important things governors do is select judges. Representative Davis had a very consistent record. He was an employee of the bar, opposing. Sure, that ad. If you watch the news coverage on that issue, on the murder that occurred in Wichita, it is far more offensive than what we put in the ad. We made a very concerted effort to not to keep the ad very manila, and I think that was very intentional. I will also say this Supreme Court is way outside of the bounds and outside of the mainstream political thought. They recently ruled in the Murdoch case an early release of 200 of the most heinous crimes in Kansas. And these people, the Kansas City Star reported on this, this isn't going to be these folks will be in prison for life. This will be an early release of 200 of the most terrible criminals in our state that will put public safety at risk. So in terms of the ad that we picked, it was a very intentional, we very intentionally made it non-offensive.
But Mark, was there not a fear-mongering strategy
No.
in it? In the
What are you talking about?
give me a sec. Yeah, Bob can hold up that. That's technically a separate ad, but there was both the ad itself of seemed to imply that Paul Davis wasn't going to keep you safe, and then even more strongly than that, there was a mailer from the Kansas Republican Party that said that exactly, that Paul Davis wasn't going to keep you safe. So you've answered the question of whether there was a racial component, and you're saying no. But was there at least a fear-mongering component to that ad?
Public safety is absolutely a relevant question in
Come
the
on,
race for governor.
everyone, please. Okay, we don't need comments, please.
Public safety is absolutely a relevant question in the race for governor. and the appointment of judges, and I don't think anybody would disagree that Paul Davis would appoint more liberal judges than Sam Brownback. That is a fact. The reality is it's a relevant conversation. We had the conversation, and we believe it was effective to Kansans, and it mattered in their votes, and we know it mattered.
Well, in 1998, Bill Graves ran an ad against Gene Bicknell that showed a pole dancer, and he later said, I regretted doing that because I didn't need to. Okay, so this, as Jim mentioned, he didn't regret it because, but as Jim mentioned, this is hardball politics, and it's no different than in past years. So I'm answering the question, yes, it's happened in Kansas before, but I tell my classes that the Republicans that want to win in Kansas are willing to take a knife, stick it in your heart, and twist. Okay? Moderates and often Democrats are shocked every 2 years when this happens. So, like in 2012, the moderate Republicans were like, "We just can't believe what happened to us in this primary." It's like, and I'm not shocked because we see it over and over. And to the credit of the Roberts campaign, they tried to get Wolf out of the race right away with the X-ray story. That should be expected. Professor Loomis asked earlier, when did people know about the strip club thing? Oh, when it happened? The Democrats should have known this was going to be an issue a year ahead of time. They should have had a strategy to figure out how they're going to deal with it so the Democratic Party could decide whether they want him to be their nominee, because it's going to come out. I mean, this is American politics, so there shouldn't be a big shock to this.
I just wanted to make one comment in response to Mark. I do agree with you that car ad had a huge impact, and we saw that. But where you lose the moderate Republicans is over the issue of judicial selection. And it's not about Paul selecting liberal judges. It's about protecting a process that allows for a nonpartisan selection of those judges. And that needs to be part of the record.
Well, judicial selection, the debate on judicial selection is not over. And it will remain a potent political conversation in elections going forward. So we look forward to having that conversation.
Okay, we're going to go to Zach. We've got some people with hands up here, guys. Somebody needs to cover them.
As Mr. Helling pointed out, the budget figures were reported very early on in the year, early and often, and the Brownback campaign denied these claims, saying that they weren't true, so there were two competing narratives. But now we know a month into his new term, Brownback is cutting capers, is cutting the transportation fund, and we are having these budget shortfalls. So do you think if voters had known on November 4th that these things were definitely going to happen, that the election would have gone the same way?
Can I just quickly, I think voters knew that. I think voters understood completely what was going to happen, and they decided it wasn't important. I mean, that's just what I was saying. It was ideology over sort of this idea of issues or facts. That's a classic example where people said, I don't think anybody who was paying attention to the governor's race knew what happened this week was going to happen. But they just said, look, cutting the pensions is not a problem for me. Mm-hmm. Cutting highway spending is not a problem for me. That's what voters said. And we have to honor that. I mean, for all that we might sort of stomp out the door, we have to honor what decisions they made. It could not have been that the electorate was unaware of what was going to happen or is happening.
Right before the election, there was a terrible revenue month for the state in October. The October revenue numbers were bad, and that story came out, and it clearly didn't have enough of an impact to swing the election. It's another question like what would have happened if the Senate race was different. It probably would have had an impact. Would it have changed who won? It's tough to say. I mean, clearly though, there was for some people, the denial probably did work in some cases. Some voters heard that the budget was not in danger, and that may have made an impact. There was also the fact that the numbers we were reporting prior to the election were that we were going to hit a shortfall in 2016. That's far enough away for people to kind of push up. Now we're hitting the shortfall in 2015, and it's become much more real for some people. Some reporters have gotten emails from people like, "Why wasn't this covered beforehand?" And we did.
I think the way the campaign ran and finishing up with the Carr brothers, social, with welfare, stuff like that. I think that was, to me, it was an implicit admission that the governor was not going to win the race on the economy, in a discussion about the economy. He was going to win it on other things, as Dave was saying. And we didn't really hear much about the economy for the last month of the campaign from the Republican side. What we heard were other things, and I think that probably ended up...
we also have to be careful not to completely conflate the economy and the budget, because just as October was a bad revenue month, it was actually a good jobs month. So you had a lot of people working. If people are employed, they're less likely to vote against the incumbent.
I think this gets to the point, and Bryan, you made the statement earlier that a lack of definition or the sort of competing visions, a clear plan versus, addressing the problems at hand. There were really two macro narratives, and that was one camp said there's something wrong, and the other camp said there's nothing wrong. And so what I think we're seeing this week, or, and we'll see in subsequent months, is a sort of tacit or otherwise admission that there is something wrong and it needs to be addressed. But what you saw, what our campaign sort of echoed was there's something wrong, it needs to be addressed. Late in the race, it sort of moved away from, and again, Bob, like you said, this is politics, this is the way it goes. I don't think any of us were shocked by tactics. I think we get into this knowing that. But at the same time, we never saw, I can tell you that every campaign strategy we drew up before we entered and during, I didn't have a single win number that got us to 50%, right? So our 46 wasn't far from where we thought we were going to win. There was a shift at the end as a result of the conversation changing.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
We're out of time. I'm going to ask one more question right here. This is going to be our last question.
Just wanted to ask, we've talked about a lot of things, and we've hinted at ethics a little bit, but when we talk about campaigns, one of the key hopes we have in an election is that everybody comes out, excuse me, feeling represented in some way. And it seems to me that the nationalization of state elections and local elections and other things means that we get to a winner-loser kind of situation where half the public, because we're very divided, is going to feel unrepresented, and that the whole game of we're going to win everything, we're going to clean sweep every state election, while it may feel good to the egos of the people that are doing, leaves about half the state really feeling underrepresented. How do we deal with that? I think it's important that the parties begin to talk about that a little bit.
I think that one, running a campaign and then governing are not obviously unrelated, but I think whatever party wins has to govern in the interest of the entire state, and you have to have that conversation in a really coherent way. And I do think one of the interesting things was in wake of the governor's initial cutbacks, so you're seeing some pushback from Republicans saying, this was done in a hurry. And I thought, so I think you can have those conversations. You've got a governor right now who is ineligible to run for another term of office, and you got to hope that he and the legislature will do the very best they can for the state of Kansas.
I'll reiterate. Campaigns are about ideas, and the governor's race was close, relatively 4% win, so not that close. But the governor's policies were on the ballot on every lower ticket race. I mean, Joan, you guys sent out thousands of mailers with the governor's picture and said state house member.
We did.
And so, and absolutely, so it was Sam Brownback's tax policy and Dennis Hedke. Sam Brownback's budget cuts and said house member. So not only was he on the ballot at the top of the ticket, but on the bottom of the ticket. And the results of that was 97 out of 125 Republicans were elected to the state house, where the governor's agenda was on the ballot. And so while I respect your statement about people not feeling represented, everybody had the opportunity to weigh in on this. A historic number of people showed up to vote. A historic number of people decided they were going to send a historic number of Republicans who endorsed the governor's agenda to the legislature. So while I appreciate those comments, I think it's important to remember that campaigns are about ideas. They're our method of self-governance, and the people have made their choice.
Yeah, I would only agree. I mean, I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. And especially in a state, since we're talking about the politics of it, you're going to get the government that you send, and you're going to, And the reality is, we're in a state, we're not a 50-50 registration state. You guys are all good at what you do, and you're great, but, I mean, politically, you're born on third here, right? You didn't hit a triple. You got 2-to-1 registration advantage. You have to work harder as somebody.
But can I also say, I think that we would all agree in this room that we did, particularly in the governor's race, have a legitimate discussion of these things. It wasn't as if it was secret or not known. We all wrote about it. It was all, so, and the people made a choice, and we should honor that. It may be not the outcome that everyone wanted, but, in our politics, what we did have in Kansas, which we almost never have, is an actual debate about issues. Usually, one of the glories of this year for a reporter is that we had a good, honest discussion about important things, and then people chose. That's all we can ever ask for.
But the new dynamic are these outside groups and the third parties, and I still, no one's giving me any credit for watching all 100 TV ads over a 2-day period. Thank you. But of the 38 ads for the governor and Senate races that were paid for by outside groups, 92% of the themes in those ads was negative. And I think, to your point, even you're right about the result in the Republicans in the legislature. There's this feeling that was just, even though there were a lot of ideas discussed, there's a cynical aspect to it, and we may lay that at the doorstep of these third-party groups who are coming in and just almost 100% negative, and there's back and forth. Dr. Loomis knows on the effect of negative ads, but Kelly's telling me he's really happy with the turnout. If you would have said $20 million in spending and every Republican since 1872 coming to the state, I would have said, God, 65% of the people are going to vote. They're going to be so excited about this. And I know you're happy with 51%. I'm not happy with 51%. I mean, why can't it be 70%? Why can't it be 60%? With that much money coming into the state, half of the voters said no thanks. And I think that's sort of the ongoing discussion that your question sort of prompts, is instead of the people who won going back to the legislature and saying, well, that was fun, we won, going, wait a second, was that really good for the state? Was that really a great debate on the ideas? Or was it our out-of-state interests or even in-state interests spending so much money that they're overwhelming what the campaigns even want to do? So that's just the thought as going forward as the question asked.
Okay, Bob, you get the last word for this panel. 2 quick announcements. I need to keep my panelists intact for photographs, so you're welcome to grab them later, but please let us get our photographs that we need here. And secondly, our national discussion will begin at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Hope that everybody can rejoin us. But please thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion.